Hello, IB history people. We are back with another video. We are reviewing the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong. Here's that screen grab again of section 14, the People's Republic of China. The parts that we're talking about today is we're still looking at the consolidation of Mao Zedong's communist state. We're looking specifically today at some social developments and women's rights. We're going to be looking at the 1950 marriage law, new marriage law, and we're going to be taking a look at land reform. So let me set the table by explaining what the situation looked like prior to communists coming to power in China. So before the communists came to power, the vast majority of China was the peasantry. The peasants comprised approximately 90% of the population. And for much of China's history, the peasants did not own their own land. They worked land that belonged to landlords. Now, when the communists were fighting the Chinese Civil War against the nationalists, in the areas that they took over, they experimented with land redistribution. This is a classic communist concept to take resources and to spread it out more equally among the people. It worked well in the areas that they controlled during the Civil War. So when the Communist Party came to power, they decided to scale that up and to do it countrywide. So in 1950, they embarked upon this program. The reason I put an asterisk after 1950 is because the communists had been experimenting with this. They had done it in a limited way during the Civil War. But now that the P.R.C. is established, they're going to do it nationwide. So how did they do it? Well, the Chinese Communist Party trained cadres. These are communists who are well trained and loyal to the regime. In this case, specifically trained in how to carry out land reform. And they fan out over the country. And upon arriving in a village, they announced what they were going to do, and they began classifying the inhabitants of the village. And they had these 6 classification categories: landlords, people who live off the rent of their tenants; rich peasants, so someone who owns enough land that they're able to rent some of it while working other land themselves; upper middle peasants, people who work their own land with hired help; middle peasants, people who work the land themselves; lower middle peasants, people who work the land of other people. The land doesn't belong to them; poor peasants, people who work the land of other people. The cadres determined the status by how much property they owned. Property is land, but also equipment, livestock, and how many people, if any, that they employed. Here we have another fabulous poster from ChinesePosters.net. According to the website, this one is dated 1952, and it's announcing that land reform has basically been accomplished. Now, once the cadres had organized the peasants into their different categories, then they announced that trials would be taking place. A kind of a legal trial, but something we would call a show trial. A show trial is a kind of trial where there is not a classic jury and the defendant is not innocent until proven guilty. A show trial is a kind of public trial where the guilt of the defendant has already been established, and the purpose of the trial is to just make that public and to involve the public in the process of shaming the guilty party. So the cadres would put the landlords on trial and encourage the tenant farmers, the peasants, to come forward and to speak bitterness, to recall the injustices done to them and their ancestors by the landlord and the landlord's ancestors in this very public, almost theatrical manner. After the trial, the property, the land, the equipment, the tools, the livestock of the landlords would be divided among the poorest inhabitants of the village. And in addition, any legal documents that had justified the land ownership by the landlords were destroyed, and the Chinese Communist Party issued new communist land, P.R.C. Land deeds to the farmers. So, looking at these photographs here, the top photograph is a show trial taking place with some peasants speaking bitterness to the landlord who's kneeling in the center. And then the propaganda photo poster is new deeds being issued to the inhabitants of a village, providing them with some land. Taking a look at land reform by the numbers, um, about 40% of arable land was seized from the landlords. About 60% of China's population received property in some form, amounting to about 300 million peasants. And that meant that many peasant families owned land for the first time ever that they could remember. For looking back at their family's lineage, it's the first time they could remember having property. A number of corrupt and cruel landlords were stripped of their power and or killed as a result of these show trials. About 1 in 6 landlord families had a member killed. Numbers range here in terms of how many people died as a result of this. This isn't the lowest number that I've seen. So I know that I've said before that I tend to lowball it, but about 1 million people died as a result of this land redistribution and the show trials. Some wealthy chose to voluntarily give up their land and their property as a means of avoiding physical punishment or death. And there were some poor peasants that used the show trials as an opportunity to wage personal vendettas against more affluent people in town. They saw this as a chance for themselves to get something personal. The photograph here is of another one of these show trials. I'd like to pause here and have you take the opportunity to think about, why did the Chinese Communist Party carry out land reform? How did it benefit China? And in what ways, if any, did it cause harm? So take a moment to reflect on that, and I will show you some possible answers in 3, 2, 1. Some things that you may have said. Why did the Chinese Communist Party do it? Well, there was extreme inequality in China, extreme economic, social inequality. Eliminating inequality, spreading out wealth, is a central tenet of communist ideology. It's something that the Chinese Communist Party was campaigning on during the Chinese Civil War. It's a policy they were implementing in the areas they had under their control. So there's this expression, not only in American politics, but you may have heard it in American politics: promises made, promises kept. Well, the Chinese Communist Party came to power on the promise that they were going to redistribute wealth. So here they are doing it. Peasants are the majority of the population, again, about 90%. So if the party empowers them, wins them over, gets brownie points with them, then they will be in a very secure position in their control over China. How was it beneficial? Quality of life improved for an enormous percent of China's population. Many people gaining land for the first time ever. And some of the landlords that were punished were, in fact, bad people, people that had committed crimes, people that were unscrupulous or unfair. That being said, was it harmful or immoral or bad in any way? Well, these trials were not fair trials. The guilt of the landlords was predetermined. There was a kind of mob mentality in these show trials. Many people who got caught up in the crossfire, the son of a landlord who never, personally did anything wrong, could be punished or have their property stripped from them. And some people used it as an opportunity for personal vendettas. In the end, we don't know the exact numbers, but maybe around 1 million people died as a result of this land reform. All right, with land reform out of the way, let's take a look at the 1950 marriage law. Before we talk about what the marriage law, the new marriage law, did in 1950, let's remind ourselves what was the status of women like in China before the People's Republic of China came to power. So I have to acknowledge the May 4th movement in China did challenge gender norms, and women made significant gains in education, in political power during the Republic of China under Chiang Kai shek. There's a period of time called the Nanjing Decade, and that's where the nationalists under Chiang Kai shek ruled China from their capital in Nanjing. Um, so there were some gains made. So what I'm about to say is a generalization. But if we look at Chinese history on the whole, especially for rural women, not urban women, rural women through much of Chinese history were governed by Confucian relationships. They found themselves in arranged marriages, and connected to that, women were metaphorically bought and sold by being put into an arranged marriage based on their parents, but they could also literally be bought and sold. Concubinage was a common phenomenon, obviously, with the emperor, but even among the elite of society. Elite men had concubines, wealthy men. Women were governed by the three obediences and the four virtues. Foot binding was a thing, even though they tried to get rid of it in the late Qing dynasty. They tried to get rid of it in the Republic of China. It continued. The practice did continue. And female infanticide, the killing of female babies because society preferred men. Over here, we have a reminder of the five Confucian relationships. The superior relationship we're referring to here is husband and wife. The husband is clearly in a higher position to the wife. As a reminder, the three obediences: women had to be obedient to their father when they were young. Then they had to be obedient to their husband when they were married. Then, if their husband passed away, they had to be obedient to their own son. Down here, we have a photograph of a person with bound feet. This is a real photograph, so this was someone who must have had their feet bound in the 1940s or 1950s. And this photograph came from a news article. I don't know, I found it a few years back, but that is the actual size of that woman's feet. When female babies were very early in their development, they would crush the feet and then bind them with a little silken booty or shoe and prevent the foot from developing normally. Having established what the status of women was like, let's now take a look at the 1950 new marriage law. In the description for this YouTube video, I'm going to provide you with a link. I would like you to skim over the document and see what are some of the aspects of the new marriage law that stand out to you. Now, remember, we want to avoid presentism. A lot of the things in the new marriage law of 1950 are going to seem obvious to you, like a no-brainer. Well, no, duh, of course that's the case. But you have to keep in mind the society that we are dealing with is this society here. So we're going from this. This is our baseline. So have a look. There's a link in the description of this YouTube video. Look over the marriage law and make some observations. We will talk about it together in 3, 2, 1. A couple of things that may have stood out to you. Chapter 1 states that there shall be equal rights in marriage. There will no longer be concubines. Polygamy is outlawed. Child marriages are outlawed. Widows may remarry. Chapter 2, there will be healthy and reasonable age limits to when people can marry. Marriage must be consensual. There cannot be arranged marriages. Families can put their input into a marriage, but ultimately it must be the husband and wife's decision. Chapter 2 also says that people need to be quote unquote fit for marriage, which is kind of giving a little bit of eugenics. They were looking at wanting to have healthy, quote unquote healthy people reproducing, people that what the state deemed to be mentally sound reproducing. Chapter 3, both sexes, men and women, are guaranteed a host of different rights. They can keep their names if they want. They're each entitled to property. They're allowed to pursue the jobs they want to pursue. Chapter 4 indicates that children of a marriage have rights as well, and they need to be supported and cared for. Chapter 5 says that divorce can take place. It has to be consensual, and the government will mediate the divorce. Chapter 6 stipulates that after a divorce, kids must be protected. And Chapter 7, divorce needs to be carried out fairly and the property divided evenly. So, having taken a look at the new marriage law of 1950, I'd like you to pause here again, and I'd like you to think about how is Chinese society at large going to react. Think about different groups or segments within society, and I'd like you to predict, what do you think will be some positive reactions? What will be some negative reactions? And are there any ways in which you think people will react that you can't classify as either clearly positive or negative? Think over that, and I will show you some possible things you could have thought of in 3, 2, 1. First, it should be noted that these changes stipulated in the new marriage law did not take place overnight. That it would take a long time for China's culture to shift. There were a lot of different reactions to women gaining all of these new rights. First off, I don't know if this should be classified as good or bad, so I'm going to put it in the neutral category. There was a huge spike in the divorce rate because it was made easier, and the stigma around it was being minimized, at least from the government's perspective. This new law did receive some backlash from male-dominated society, local officials, male property owners, because it was seen as an attack on a patriarchal society, an attack on the traditional position of men in society. Some women were accused of serial flirting. Some women were intimidated or beaten for seeking divorce and remarriage. It broke many of the traditional Confucian ideas that were seen as archaic, backward, harmful. And now the state, not some ancient doctrine, was the arbiter of family relations. Another great poster here from ChinesePosters.net. This one is dated 1953, and the caption is, "Do your own thing." I love that one. This is a good opportunity to make a reference to historiography, something that is important in the IB program. There is not a strong historical consensus about how effective this marriage reform law was or what exactly its impacts were. The reason for that is because scholarship on this topic is still very much evolving. Why is it evolving? Because scholars are still learning from people who have been, over the past decades, opening up about their lived experience from these changes. Furthermore, after the period of Mao Zedong under Deng Xiaoping, as China went through reform and opening up, more and more government documents became available for analysis. Thirdly, the methods of historians use to analyze social science data is also evolving. So that is why there is not a clear consensus on what the impact of this marriage law reform was. And it's an area where you're seeing a lot of fresh scholarship with new and different takes. And to illustrate that, I did a screenshot here of a JSTOR article re-examining the impact of the 1950 marriage law. And this is just one of many articles that you can find that are examining and re-examining the impact of the new marriage law. There were two other early campaigns that were relevant to the consolidation of power in the early 1950s. So I'm going to include them here in this video clip. those were the 3 anti and 5 anti campaigns. I'm just going to talk about them together. The chart that you see here comes from Jonathan Spence's A History of Modern China. I'm sorry, The Search for Modern China. So the 3 and 5 anti campaigns were campaigns where Communist Party cadres fanned out across the country, focusing on urban centers, and they went to factory workers and coached them on how to detect corruption and tax evasion among Chinese factory owners and business people. These campaigns pitted the urban proletariat against the urban bourgeoisie. Guilty parties, people accused of being serious lawbreakers or, semi-law abiding, they were made to confess their crimes through something called self-criticism, which is going to be a form of public punishment that is going to be used from this point going forward. The self-criticism is where someone sits down, is told that they have done wrong, and then they have to sit down and explain what they did, why it was wrong, and how remorseful they are. I should correct myself. They're not always public. Sometimes they're written privately, but they could also be public. Similar to the show trials, the person's guilt is already determined, and the purpose of a self-criticism is for the society to see that this person wants to reform and they want to get in line with what the state wants them to do. These 3 and 5 anti-campaigns gave the Chinese Communist Party greater control over businesses and business leaders in the urban parts of China, whereas the land reform was giving them a lot of influence over rural areas. So you can see here this data from the 5 anti-campaign in Shanghai, dated 1952. They divided all of the businesses into small and medium firms, and they determined how many of them were completely law-abiding, and then from there they had different classifications for how deviant or law-breaking the other firms had been. And that's all for this video. As a review, today we went over 1950 land reform. We took a look at the new marriage law of 1950, and then I talked about the 3 and 5 anti-campaigns. Stay tuned for the next video.